Welcome back. All right, so last night there was just the 4 games on. Now, the difference between the light nights in the NHL and the really crazy busy ones, like tonight, we're going to have 10 games on at the same time for a while there. I tend to get a little bit burnt out during the ten games at the same time nights unless I take a little bit of a break here and there where I can. So in between periods, if everything's on an intermission, sometimes it's like 5 minutes. I'm like, I got 5 minutes to just go out and depressurize. But on the quiet nights where there's only a couple of games on, I'll watch the intermission shows. Last night I listened to Anson Carter explain that he didn't feel like the Vancouver Canucks, specifically Jim Rutherford, needed to apologize for the way that the Bruce Boudreau situation was handled. It was basically on the lines of, look, coaches get fired all the time. I don't see the big deal. This was just coach firing, and kind of insinuated as kind of the same as the others, and also threw in there that trade deadline's coming up and it's a frustrating time for players. It's hard on players. Said he didn't have kids when he was younger because he didn't want them being bombarded at school with kids asking them where their dad was going and when he was getting traded and that kind of thing. And I would imagine that kids of hockey players probably get ragged on quite a bit at school depending on who their dad is. What was your dad doing last night behind the net? What a bonehead. That kind of thing, right? Yeah, so I understand where he's coming from. I do. And so I'm not going to just flat out say he's wrong and what a dumb take. I do think that there are times where people are just cavalier about this guy getting traded and that guy getting traded, and it can come across as insensitive because it does. It changes. I mean, you're as a hockey player, for a lot of the younger guys, sure, they might be single. It might be easier for them to pick up and move. But for the guys who've got kids, they've got kids in school. Those kids have friends. And it can be a frustrating time. And then they're expected to, sometimes within 48 hours, to suit up for the new team, go out on the ice and play like nothing's going on. And I could imagine there are players who during the game are probably, their minds are thinking, all right, so did she get the kids today? We've got that flight, and then we've got to plan out, and we've got to see this house tomorrow. Like, there's probably a lot of things going on, right? And so we as fans demand the best. So, okay, let's say Patrick Kane goes to New York. We would expect him to hit the ice in New York and play great. You and Panarin are going to play great, even though you haven't played together for years, and your styles might have changed a little bit since the last time we played together. Doesn't matter. Go out there, play great. That's what we expect. And that's the expectation. And again, people would say, well, they make a lot of money. Right. And that's the trade-off. Coaches in the NHL make a lot of money too, although not every NHL coach's salary is known. In some cases, it's guessed about. Some cases, it is known and they'll disclose it. And I was looking too, and I was like, do coaches have a union? They have an association. They don't really have a union per se. So they don't have the same amount of protection as a player does as part of the union, right? And we can debate about the union and what it does or doesn't do for the players at some other point. But I think we can kind of agree that coaches don't have the same level of protection that the players would, right? So I want to look at this, and I thought, all right, so what criteria would I use here? So no movement clauses. Well, players have that. Coaches don't. You don't trade a coach. That's not a thing. So this is one difference between the player argument and the coach argument. Yes, your kid might get bothered in school, but if you have a no movement clause, you decide where you go and when. If you have a no trade clause, you decide where you go and when. It might be a 10-team no trade. I'm not going to these 10 places. You have some say in where you go. And most really high-profile players will have that. Now, the counter is, well, what about the guys who are on the entry-level money? Right. And guys who end up on waivers and bounce around the league. I've talked about feeling bad for guys who bounce around the league for many of the same reasons that we would talk about guys getting traded at the trade deadline and all the problems they would have. I can't imagine for like Nick Aube-Kubel, he's switched teams twice unexpectedly. And so I can imagine that throws everything into some sort of an upheaval, and it can be tough, right? So I'm going to jump down to family upheaval, and I'm going to say it's equal. I'm going to say it's equal because for going back to Boudreau, just as the one coach that's been fired this year, that affects his wife. They had to get, they move out of their house. They're moving back to Hershey, Pennsylvania. At least that's what I was reading. That's where he's from and all that. So that's fun. there's a place for Bruce Boudreau to go, it would be Hershey, Pennsylvania, because sure, you hear Hershey and you think chocolate, and it's like, Bruce probably would enjoy a little bit of chocolate after everything he went through over the last few weeks. But the family upheaval, it's not exactly the same, and it's going to affect both. And so that's something that both the player and the coach have. But when we talk about job security, players have that. Players have job security right now in a way that they never have before. 8-year contracts, that's almost a decade. And so if somebody wants to buy you out, well, that's now 16 years of a headache they've bought themselves with a buyout. The 8-year contracts, they really don't get bought out either. So players have a certain level of job security. And not only that, but if we look at the NHL this year, trades have been at, I'll say, a record low over the last 3 years before the trade deadline. Trade deadline, things can get a little bit crazy. But in that case, too, you're dealing with guys who are probably on expiring contracts. So they already know come July they might be switching locations anyways, right? They already know. So if you know I might be moving in July, but I might end up moving in February or March, yeah, there's a difference there, but you still know you're going to move. You still know there's a good chance you're going to move. At this point in time, some of the UFAs are going to have a good idea. I'm not going to be in this location next year, and they likely will have already started making some plans where the NHL schedule will allow them time to make those plans. And then the easier to replace, well, this one's not as easy. I'm going to give that point to the coach. That they're easier to replace. And yet it depends on the player, doesn't it? So if you're talking about Sidney Crosby, you can't replace Sidney Crosby. But if you look at the Penguins, if you're looking at Chad Ruhwedel, Josh Archibald, players of that ilk, players who play further down the lineup, they're easier to replace. And in this cap crunch that we're dealing with, I think there are players who are currently not in the NHL that if not for the cap crunch probably would be. Where teams just don't have the money to offer that guy $1.5-2 million, so he ends up in Europe. And they'd rather bring somebody in on an entry-level contract. It saves them that little bit of money so that they can afford to keep the rest of the roster together. So I will say that coaches, I think, are easier to replace, and it's weird how I'm wording check marks. Because I'm saying the players have the no movement clause, which is an advantage to them. The job security, I think, is an advantage, and they have the advantage when it comes to easier to replace, I think. But again, this is the one tricky part when you're talking about the NHL, is that, and in sports in general, is that we can all focus on, how much does Garrett Cole get paid? He gets paid so much money. And you're not paying attention to, the shortstop that plays 20 games, that might be it for his career. How much money did he make? And yes, it's more than most of us would make. But if you're an athlete and you're playing as a professional athlete and you're the best in the world at what you do, I think it's justified that you make some good money. And there's definitely a system that says, hey, you're worth this much because the owners and the managers say they're worth that much. And the marketplace says they're worth that much. So when we look at pay, it's a little different between coaches and players as well. Mike Babcock, the highest paid coach in NHL history according to Cap Friendly, was paid $6.25 million per season by the Toronto Maple Leafs. Currently, Peter Laviolette on an expiring contract, $4.9 million. I will also state that not every coach's salary is known. Not every team divulges that information. So it is possible there's a coach out there that makes more than Peter Laviolette at $4.9 million. Right now, the current highest salaried paid player, again, according to Cap Friendly, and salary's totally different from the cap hit, is Tyler Seguin. Tyler Seguin makes $13 million this year. His cap hit's $9.85 million. So the cap hit and the talk about everybody, this guy's greedy and that guy's greedy, Tyler Seguin is the highest salaried player. So that is more than double the amount of the highest known coach's salary in the National Hockey League. And they're a lot younger. Because I was thinking, well, I could put age on here, but that's pretty obvious, right? Obviously, players are younger. Their whole lives are ahead of them. And they can get work as analysts after. They can start their podcasts after. There's various avenues for players now. And if they save their money, they're good. If they save their money, they should be good. And that That's where it gets dicey when you're getting into the players who are making $750,000 at the NHL level, but at the AHL level they make maybe $125,000. It's still good money, but can you create a nest egg for the rest of your life on $125,000 a year? It depends on all your expenses. Are you married? Do you have kids? Are like you trying to buy a house? Like there's a lot of considerations there. I do think that we as sports fans will be pretty cavalier about players getting moved. One of the reasons I don't like to report on unsubstantiated rumors is because these guys are human beings. And I feel like with the channel's reach that I need to be responsible about what's out there. So I'm not going to, make up or come up with rumors from various rumor sites and say, oh, this team's picking up and that team's picking up. Like I realized about, I want to say 5 years ago, that it was more for clicks than actually for what's really happening. Because I would see like, oh, this week this is happening. This week, this. And I'm thinking, no, it's not. It's not. It's just what are you talking about? And so eventually I just stopped looking at those sites for anything because I was like, I don't believe that those GMs are talking because the last time I heard rumors about which GMs were talking to which they were wrong, and I don't see why these ones would be accurate. But I do try to make sure that I'm not adding to that noise because some of that is going to filter to the players. Because I've seen where somebody will say, well, what if the New York Islanders wanted this player? And the next thing you know, there's an article of, does this guy fit in New York? And suddenly it's, well, I've heard that guy's been tied to the Islanders. And it's like, do you guys understand that this came from just somebody speculating? And it's become this big thing now where everybody's like, hey, the Islanders are in on this guy. I had no idea. And they're not. And so I understand where Anson Carter's coming from there. I'm not dismissing it. But to compare it to coaches being fired, coaches are out of work. And yes, very often they can find other jobs. There are coaches who will then be cycled through as assistant coaches, associate coaches, might be, working with the young guys and working in a training capacity. But there are times where guys get fired and they're just gone. They're out. That's it. And for a coach that's new, if it's a disaster under him, as a new coach, he could be gone halfway through that first year and not get another chance at the NHL job. Whereas a player will get chance after chance after chance, depending on, was he drafted in the first round? Is he a big guy? Can he skate? And so if he's got certain attributes, teams will give him a chance. Whereas a coach might not get that. So I do consider it to be apples to oranges. I do think that while I definitely empathize with players going through what they go through at trade deadline time, and we're gearing up to go through that again. It is part of the game. And yes, coaches being fired is part of the game too, but it is a completely different scenario altogether. And I can't even think of an equal. Like I've been trying for the last 12 hours to think of an equivalent between a coach knowing he's going to get fired weeks before it happens and a player knowing where he's getting traded to and for what, and just not having it done yet. I can't think of an equivalent to that. And especially since, as I mentioned, with no movement clauses, no trade clauses, it might be a place he wants to go, right? So, like, for instance, Bo Horvat, he has been a Canuck for ages. He's the team captain, big part of the identity. But he's had some time to think this over. He's refused the best offer, apparently, from the Canucks. He knows what that means. And so he's in control of this. He could have accepted that offer and said, fine, I'll stay for $7.5 million for whatever it is. I'll stay. And he's choosing not to. And that's, again, different than a coach who comes in without a contract extension and, again, is left hung out to dry. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through, you just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.